Howdy, see people filing in. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes here. Apologies, very creaky chair, but that's the way it goes. Well, we have a question in chat about whether or not it's okay to record this session. You can. We're also recording the session, and we'll make it available to folks who attend later. I'll give you a link to that at some point in a follow-up email, I think. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Like I said, we're going to get started in a minute here. All right. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get rolling? I don't want to hold everybody up too much. We appreciate you spending some time with us this afternoon. I'm Pat McConnell. I'll be your presenter today for our webinar, which is called Myths and Misunderstandings That Kill Agile in Government. I am Chief Instructor and a Certified Scrum Trainer with Next Up Solutions. A little bit about me. This is me. There's too many words on this slide, but I do that so I can put them all in one place so we can forget them quicker, because that's probably the least important thing that we'll talk about today. I'm Dr. Patrick McConnell. You can call me Pat or Patrick because my PhD is going to be irrelevant to pretty much everything we'll talk about today. So don't worry about that. I have been an Agilist for well over a decade at this point. Almost every single bit of that, except for some things in the last year or so, have been in the public sector, working here in the DC area for government agencies, mostly federal, but also some state and locals. You can see on the slide there just a few of the badges of some of the places where I've either done Agile while being on teams in some framework or another, or as a coach, and then more recently as a trainer. I started off my Agile journey as a product owner building geospatial applications for government agencies. So my background is in mapping stuff. Later, I became a Scrum Master for a while, ultimately becoming a full-time Agile coach for a bunch of years, and ended up directing the Agile practices Center of Excellence for one of the gigantic government-focused system integrator companies that was here in town. That whole time I was also pursuing becoming a certified Scrum trainer. Finally did that a couple of years ago. And these days I just get to teach classes about Scrum and other Agile stuff and make grown-ups play silly games. So that's fun. Because so much of my experience is in the public sector and I'm used to working with very, very large organizations, that also means I've got a lot of experience with scaling, which we'll touch on a little bit in this webinar too. And then when it comes to relevant Agile certifications, for me, they're kind of like, I don't know, Pokemon, I guess. I have to catch them all. But I've got certifications in pretty much every team level framework, plus most of the scaling ones, plus other not all that related anymore things like project management professional, all that kind of thing. So that's me. I've been doing this for a real long time and mostly for government. So if the challenges you see there are like the challenges that I've seen a whole lot, we can have an interesting discussion today. All right, so enough of that. Let's go ahead and get rolling here. Before I get into the myths that I want to talk about this afternoon, I want to start with this disclaimer, which is no department or agency is a monolith. So as I mentioned, I've done Agile in over 50 federal agencies. Their success and kind of value return on Agile adoption of various flavors, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or something else, varies wildly, basically program by program. And no matter how much even an entire agency really understands and wants to push for solid Agile practices, you still might see significant variation all over that agency. So if in your particular environment, you've seen some of the things I'm talking about, don't feel like it has to be like that or it's like that everywhere. There are programs that are doing amazing stuff, that are getting lots of value out of their Agile adoptions, and some that aren't. And just on the other side too, there are vendors who really get it and vendors who really don't. And well, that's kind of that. So I'm aware no agency or department is a monolith. Your experiences may vary. All right, some spoilers real quick. Here are the myths I'm going to talk about this afternoon. There are plenty of others. These are just the 5 that I feel like I keep running into over and over and over again. So we're going to talk about misunderstandings like the fact that story points don't actually have any absolute meaning, but people think they do, and that hurts us sometimes. That people don't necessarily understand the importance of what product owners need to be. And when we treat that more as a title, that bites us in a whole lot of ways. Third myth I'm going to talk about is the notion that more awareness somehow equals more control. We're often really invested in awareness systems, thinking it gives us more control over situations, and it doesn't necessarily. It does cost us more money and time, though. The fourth one is that we can talk about wanting teams, but in the end, we can still think about all work as being done by individual people tied to specific job titles. That probably doesn't help us that much either. We like cross-functionality, and when we ignore it, it's often at our peril. And the last one I'll talk about is the myth that safe will save you. And that is not just about safe, it's actually about any scaling framework, but that's the one I run into most often is people who think that if we adopt safe, that will fix all of our problems. When in fact, often our problems are deeper than that and more structural, and safe won't necessarily make them better if we don't change those conditions. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to kind of roll through things, and then we'll save some time at the end for questions as we go through, and that'll do. All right, so let's start with number 1, the notion that story points have absolute meaning. If you're not familiar with what a story point is, in Agile frameworks, especially ones like Scrum, we like these fuzzy relative estimating schemes, and story points or complexity points, which is most often expressed as some kind of Fibonacci scale, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. That's often a method that teams will use to size the variable work that is in their backlogs, the list of things that they might do in the future. The problem we often have, though, is that people think those numbers translate into a linear measure like time, and they don't. Part of the reason we use these fuzzy measures is because estimating elaborative and creative work is really, really difficult. It's basically a Herculean task cognitively for our human brains. And the reason for that is when we talk about estimates, we often talk about effort. We use those 2 words as if they're synonyms, and they're not. When we estimate creative, elaborative work, like say software development, we're actually trying to parse a bundle of dimensions at the same time. Effort, how long do I think this is going to take? Complexity, how many guesses am I making though in that effort guess? And risk, which would be how much more time might this take if some of the guesses are wrong? And the problem we have is that those dimensions don't necessarily vary together. They're really, really difficult for us to parse out. This is why estimating creative tasks like software development is historically so hard, why we're so bad at it. This is a very well-studied thing in the computer science literature, by the way. If you look back, you can see meta-analyses looking at studies of estimating software development going back 30, 35 years at this point. And in general, what they show, and you can look this up in some of Mike Cohn's work, for example, is that we are super bad at estimating how long it's going to take to build software. In general, if you look at the correlation between the estimates of software development and the actuals at the end of the day, when we're done and we can actually see how long it took, as a function of how long we spend coming up with the estimates, the numbers are super depressing. And that's actually what the curve on this chart shows. What it shows basically is, and we've known this for a long time, best case, if we spend about half our day estimating work instead of doing the stuff, just thinking about how long it might take, we might generate estimates that are in general about 50% correlated to the actual, which means they're only off by plus or minus 100% of the guess. And to come up with those numbers that were only 100, well, plus or minus 100% off, we spent 4 out of 8 hours every day not building stuff, but just estimating it. That's so much time to spend to be wrong? And if that's true, by the way it is, how did we ever come up with project schedules in the past, like in a waterfall context, that were true? Well, you might not want to say it out loud, but the answer is we didn't. We've just been lying for forever. We would do things like go talk to the people like the people we might hire someday to do the work and ask them, how long do you think it's going to take to build me this system? And then give us some number in the thousands of hours. And then we multiply that by 3. And if we're lucky, we're only a little late in the end. So we've just been lying for a long time. The euphemism for that you might know is management factor. There's a lot of management factor in my schedule. It means we padded it and we're just kind of crossing our fingers and hoping for the best. So instead of being wrong with those linear estimates like time that take forever, in Agile approaches like Scrum, we instead use these fuzzier methods of estimating, like story points or t-shirt sizes, what have you. The problem we have is that a system like story points, which again is this kind of modified Fibonacci scale, it's really just a ranking system. The comparisons we can make with those estimates are more than or less than, but we can't say how much more or how many times more. That's way too much math. The sizes are really ranks. They're not quantities. Unfortunately, the names of the ranks in systems like story points look like numbers. The ranks are numbers, and we think we know how numbers work. What that leads to then is somebody thinking that, okay, fine, we're not going to do hourly estimates anymore. We're going to do story points instead, but I get it. It's really just a proxy for effort, right? So someone might ask you like, hey, how many people are on that team? 8. How many points are they doing a sprint? 40. How long are their sprints? 10 days. Cool. Now I know the story point to time conversion. And I know they've got 493 points left in their next release. So based on my math, I know what day and time they'll finish. And if I add more people to their team, they'll go faster. Wait, no, that's not how any of this works, actually. If that team actually bothered to keep track of the total task hours inside of some backlog item that they've been asked to build, comparing that to the ranks, the story point rank sizing they'd given it, they might see something like this chart where down at the bottom end of the scale, things are pretty small and they stay pretty small. But as we go up to bigger and bigger sizes, the variation inside of those ranks gets bigger and bigger and bigger because we're less and less certain about the work. There's more effort involved, yeah, but probably also a lot more complexity and a lot more risk. We're saying more and more we don't really know. So as we give it a bigger size, whether it's story points or t-shirt sizes or whatever, the variation of the total time it might take us to build that thing probably increases a lot. And the scales might not necessarily be discrete. Sometimes something we call, let's say, an 8 might take us a little longer than something we called a 13 because we're just guessing about the stuff. So we use these fuzzy scales because we value accuracy over precision. All the accuracy and precision we really need with these scales is if we call something an 8, it's usually more than a 5 and often less than a 13. If that's typically true, we're doing amazing at estimating. That's all the precision we need to plan a fixed iteration like a sprint, which might be 2 weeks of work or something like that, or to guess at how many sprints we might need to finish a bundle of things we think are going to release. But if we start thinking that these ranks are numeric quantities, that leads to a lot of bad things. First of all, it leads to the ability to make a bunch of assumptions about work without ever talking to the teams doing the work. That causes a problem for us. It also causes a problem sometimes in thinking that we can gauge value delivery by measures like velocity that are based on adding up points of work that's finished at the end of iterations. So this hurts us in a bunch of ways. When this myth plays out in acquisition in public sector work, you often see things in contracts like this. Vendors shall bid the number of story points required to complete scope within a task order. Or government shall determine and estimate backlog items. Vendor shall bid number of iterations to complete specified backlog items. In both of these cases, what's happened is someone has missed the fact that these estimates are fuzzy, is treating them like a numeric quantity as just being a proxy for work, which means even though we're talking about agility now, we're backing in to classic waterfall firm fixed price kind of assumptions. and we're just putting weird Agile contract furniture into the contract, this is still going to behave and feel just like fixed scope, fixed schedule, fixed quality kind of delivery, when the whole premise of Agile frameworks in the first place is that I can only actually fix two of those things. So if we're going to fix quality at a level that's potentially shippable, then I can only fix scope or schedule, but I can't do both without lying. And the whole point of this was that we wanted to use a lighter weight method so we wouldn't have to lie anymore. So that's what this myth looks like in acquisition. In execution, once we're actually doing the work, if someone still has this understanding that points are some kind of numeric quantity that have absolute meaning outside of a team, it feels more like this. You see things like contract is on a cost plus award fee basis, with the award fee determined based on number of story points completed. But story points are not value, so I can do 1 billion of them in a sprint, never actually release anything. That doesn't tell you about value delivery. I just got good at looking busy because we accidentally structured a contract that valued looking busy over delivering. Or for example, I've also seen bonus language or cost plus award fee kind of language written in contracts about needing to improve velocity continually. So velocity is just the sum of all the points of work that a particular team completes in a sprint, if they're estimating in points. So if you see a clause like vendor team shall demonstrate improvement in velocity of X% per sprint, well, that's just how many things are we doing. I can game that really easily. And now I'm making that the focus of the work instead of delivery. Points have become the point instead of product, which is a game that I can win while we all lose. That's not what we want. So how do we fix this? Well, we have to get people to understand this. And here's an example of this playing out in real life. Some years back, I was brought into a big organization with a bunch of teams to assess them. And when I asked management, why am I here as a coach? Why are you paying for very expensive me to be here? Their answer was, we want to make sure we're getting all the points we can out of our teams every sprint. And I said, okay, cool. Everybody double your estimates. I'm going to go home. And management said, that's not what we meant. I said, yeah, I know. So anyway, the second team that they had me spend a sprint with, management hated them. This whole program was mad at this team. They actually called them their black sheep team. That was a quote. Management said, we really want to know what you think of these people. They're our black sheep team. And I said, well, why are they the black sheep team? And management said, because they only do this many points a sprint. And I said, okay, what do you think they should be doing? And they said, this many. And it was a much bigger number, whatever the number was. I said, okay. So I spent a whole sprint with that team. And what I found out was they were an amazing team. 7 people on the dev team. They've got a full-time scrum master, full-time product owner, and they're delivering a lot of value. They're doing whatever the points are, I don't know, 8, 9 backlog items a sprint, which is about what they planned. So they're making realistic plans, which means their roadmaps are probably true. That's cool. They can set realistic expectations with their stakeholders. They're delivering to production every 2 to 3 months, not because that's as fast as they can go, but because that's the most often, they figured out, that they can change production without making their users mad and alienating them to the point where people abandon their tool to use another tool that we were trying to sunset. And they had a great product owner who was super good at saying no to requests that didn't actually meet the outcome goals of the organization. So for example, people would come up to him and go, your team needs to build this for me. And he would go, no. And they would go, but you have to because I outrank you. And he would go, yeah, but I'm the product owner for this product. I have authority over its direction. And my job as product owner is to increase the users and decrease the O&M cost of this application. And your request does neither of those things. So go away. It was really hard for people to argue with that. I thought they were a great team, but management hated them because whatever velocity they had wasn't enough from management's point of view. The next team that I went to look at, management said, you're going to love these people. There are rock stars. And I said, why are they the rock stars? And management said, they do so many points a sprint. And I said, cool. All right, well, I'll go spend some time with them. I was a little nervous because I've been an Agile coach long enough that in my head, when someone says rock star, my brain automatically translates that word to jerks that we put up with because we've decided they're very productive. So I was already very nervous about the rock stars. But anyway, I spent a whole sprint with them. I found out they do, in fact, do a ton of points, like way, way, way more than the black sheep team. Here's part of why they do so many points. First of all, that team had 23 people on it. Of course, they do more stuff in a 2-week sprint than the black sheep team. It's like 3.5 teams of people from a Scrum point of view. So that's just physics. Of course, they do more stuff in that time. But even with 23 people, if you look at what's in their sprints, they're doing literally 200 to 250 quote unquote product backlog items in a sprint. Now, product backlog items are supposed to be vertical slices of product that have value and are independent, that would make sense to a user, kind of tangible increments of value. Even with 23 people, if you're doing 250 backlog items in a sprint, those aren't backlog items. Those are barely even tasks. Those are efforts that can be measured in minutes and have no through line to something that actually has institutional value from this team. You look at what they're doing in sprints, it's like, oh, we have to go talk to another team this sprint. Backlog item. I have to go to the bathroom. Backlog item. Hey, look how many backlog items we closed. We're so good at doing backlog items. But what about value delivery? What about product? I asked them, how did your last release go? And they said, we just did that for the first time. And I said, you've been a team for 1.5 years and you've shipped once? And they said, yep. I said, wow, that's not very often. I hope it gets faster. How'd the release go though? And they said, well, everything's on fire, but we're working on it. And I said, I thought you were the Rockstar team. And they said, we do a lot of points. And I said, yeah, you do. So because management's whole understanding of value was wrapped around points, they incentivized point delivery. Rockstar's super good at doing points, at having great velocity, horrible at actually delivering value. Black Sheep team, great at value, but they're not playing the game management was looking for. So we aren't actually incentivizing their awesomeness, which is a problem. So how do we fix that? Well, we've got to coach and we've got to educate people. We've got to educate our customers and our stakeholders on approaches like relative estimating. That the point of relative estimating is just forward planning utility. It's not a proxy for accounting. It doesn't tell us anything about value. It's just a way to make guesses about things like what'll fit into the next sprint. How many sprints might we need to finish a release? Those are really the only uses for estimating in Agile approaches like Scrum. But if we treat them as some kind of value proxy, if we treat them as accounting measures or budget, progress measure, we're going to have a lot of issues. And then the final thing is we need to continually reinforce that product is progress, not some proxy measure, not earned value metrics, not velocity, actual touchable stuff in production, and the frequency with which we can deliver, that's what we want. Not all of the proxies of proxies of proxies of information about status. We'll talk about some of those later. All right, so that's the first myth. It causes problems for us, the notion that story points have some kind of quantitative value or that they have meaning across teams or things like that, and they don't. All that really matters is team by team by team, however they're doing estimating, can they use that estimating method to make reasonable guesses about near-term plans? That's it. That's all that matters. Next up, let's take a look at this one. Product owner is just another hat. So a thing that happens a whole lot in agility in the public sector is, let's say we have an agency that wants to hire Scrum teams. We're going to hire someone to give us Scrum teams. Okay. So you're going to supply development team members and you're going to supply Scrum masters, but it's our money. I have budget authority, so we're going to give you the product owner. Okay, cool. We don't really understand what product owners are, though. Oops, that creates a problem for us. So let's talk for a second about what product owners are supposed to be. Scrum is one of many Agile frameworks that are out there. It's probably the most common one at the team level. And in Scrum, which is just, again, one of many different Agile frameworks, we have 3 roles: product owner, development team, and Scrum master. Scrum master is a team level coach and servant leader, helping this group of people be the best possible Scrum team they can be, helping them deliver value, helping them continually improve. But the other 2 roles, product owner and dev team, have an interesting relationship on a Scrum team. They are co-equal partners. Product owner is one person per product with authority over the vision of the product. And they are, this is an outdated term, but I still like it. We often talk about them as the single ringable neck for deciding what a team is going to do in what order. And they're there to represent the voice of all of the various kinds of stakeholder for this particular effort, whatever it is. Product owners own the questions what and why and when. What are we doing? Why should we do those things? What order should we do them in? That's the product owner's authority. And I want one person in that role so that they can actually make choices. They should have absolute authority over the direction of the product in at least sprint-long increments, which are typically a couple of weeks at a time. So that's our product owner role. Meanwhile, we have this development team, which is a cross-functional group of people who's actually going to build the product. Collectively, they have all the skills to go from an idea to whatever done means in one sprint. They own all questions of how. So if product owner owns what are we doing and why are we doing it, once the dev team understands what it is to be done, they own all questions of how the stuff will be done. The issue we have is those two roles, product owner and dev team, they're really co-equal partners because neither role can outperform the other. It doesn't matter how good the dev team is if we build the wrong stuff or we build it in the wrong order. It doesn't matter how good the product vision is if the dev team can't execute it. So they're equally accountable for the work and they need to collaborate every day. That's often where the problem is for us because product owner tends to be a full-time job at least per product, often per team that's supporting that product. Instead, what happens often is, as many of you I'm sure are aware, a lot of the agencies I've worked with over the years have been under hiring freezes for like a decade at this point. So everybody already has 12 jobs, and every time somebody quits or retires or, heaven forbid, dies, you get a new job. So here's your new hat. Do this too. So we declare somebody product owner, they've already got 12 other roles. They don't have the skills to do product ownership. They don't have the time. Often they aren't even connected to the communities we're supposed to be representing as the voice of the customer in discussions with the dev team or the user in those discussions. Yeah, it's a problem. So who do we actually need in the product owner role? Well, let's take a look at what we need product owners to do. On a day-to-day basis, you might think of product owners as mostly doing things like this: backlog refinement, the what and why questions, and prioritization, which is ordering that list. We call all that list of things a team might do, a Scrum team might do in the future, we call it the product backlog. So refining and prioritizing that backlog, those are product owners' kind of prime everyday jobs. In addition to that, they're doing things like continually clarifying vision, helping the team understanding that, helping other people understand that, and maybe trying to communicate that vision through some kind of lightweight artifact like a product roadmap or something. So yeah, that's all what product owners do every day. So who do we need in this role? Who should be the product owner? Well, first and foremost, we need someone who is the best, most expert in what this product or business area is. What is the user community for this tool? What are the missions involved? Who are our various stakeholders? What's the political environment that we're delivering in? All that kind of stuff. More than anyone else, I need this product owner to know that stuff and have relationships with those people so that we can talk to them all the time. In addition to that knowledge, I also need the product owner to have a couple of superpowers. They need the absolute authority to make choices over product direction in sprint-long increments at least, and very importantly, the willingness to use that authority to make choices. And often the problem I run into is someone has been declared product owner and they have one but not the other. So they have the knowledge to make choices, but they're not allowed to because they don't have budget authority. Or they have budget authority, they don't want to make choices because making choices is scary. In the public sector a lot, for example, I feel like a lot of my federal customers have an invisible item at the top of their backlogs that never goes away. The most important things for us to do in every sprint is whatever happens, keep me out of the Washington Post. Making choices is scary. We're never allowed to do a thing that'll fail. So I need someone who understands that we're making choices in small increments. It's okay to try stuff. The last quality for that reason that I look for in a product owner would be someone with an empirical mindset, someone who understands that I don't have to know everything up front. The whole reason we do short sprints in Scrum is so that we can do a thing to a point where we can show it to somebody and it makes sense to them. And then we can ask them, is this enough yet? So that empiricism, that experimentality, it means really we can treat every sprint as an experiment because we're making really tiny bets. We aren't gambling 5 years of funding on a choice. We're gambling at most a couple weeks at a time, maybe. It's a much, much smaller guess. It's less scary. So that's who I need in the product owner role. Someone with the time to do the job, someone with the knowledge to do the job, and someone who's willing to do the job. And if I don't have all of those things, I end up with all these weird anti-patterns. I end up with teams with proxy product owners who are making choices, but they aren't technically allowed to, or teams that can never talk to their product owner. We don't know what we're building, all those kind of things. The last thing to bear in mind about what product owners are supposed to be doing is their primary goal, which is to maximize return on investment. That means, what is the most outcome I can get on my mission objectives for whatever this product is going to be, for the least amount of output from the team? What's the smallest thing I can ask the team to do that meets the need so I can move on and meet the other need? But it's easy to lose sight of that. It's easy to focus on output, which causes some of the problems I just talked about with the last myth, instead of outcomes like usership or mission utility or things like that. So what does this myth feel like in practice? Well, in acquisition, you see things in contracts like vendor teams shall be assigned to government product owners to be determined after award, meaning we don't know who knows about this. Yes, we'll tell you later, which probably often means we end up with someone who's just kind of a stucky rather than a person who actually has the knowledge and skills to do the role. The other outcome we get a lot is you also get people who are declared product owners, but they don't have the authority to make choices. You end up with no one really owning the backlog. Either no one makes choices, or worse, everyone kind of owns the backlog, which means we don't know who to pay attention to. Sprint to sprint to sprint. It's not clear who actually gets to make choices. So that's the kind of language we sometimes see if this myth is going to be present back at the acquisition stage. Later in execution, this feels like teams who can tell you, I don't know who my product owner is. Well, why wouldn't you know? We're supposed to be able to talk to them every day. But if we don't know, clearly something is broken. Or my team has 2 product owners, a project manager, a program manager, and a product director. So who actually makes the choices? The answer is probably everybody, which is a problem because those people probably don't all agree on the same things, which means the team is always wrong. Everything they choose to do in the sprint was not the right thing according to somebody who also has authority of the backlog. That's a problem for us. So that's why we want a single person in the role with the authority and willingness and capability to do the job. So the outcome for that is we never end up doing the most valuable stuff because we're always swinging our heads from one whim to another, and also the team ends up hating their life. So how do we fix that? Assume product ownership, whether you're going to provide the product owner as the government customer or you're going to ask the vendor to provide you someone very skilled to do that. Assume that that role needs to be a full-time job, at least per product, probably per team. And they should be supported by a skilled Scrum Master, because remember, Scrum Masters are team-level coaches, not just coaching dev teams, also coaching product owners to get better at product ownership, and coaching the relationship between product owners and dev team. So a good Scrum Master helps us fix issues in this role if there are issues. So both of those things together, we want them on teams. Train your product owners, give them good access to training, get them coaching in product ownership as well if you can. Make sure product owners aren't just declared stuckies. Make sure they actually have absolute authority over that product direction in at least sprint-long increments. You know, if it's 2 weeks or whatever your sprint is, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, hopefully not longer than a month. Shorter is usually better. The last thing is your product owners, whoever they are, if there's some kind of contractual firewall between product owner and, say, dev team and Scrum Master, like product owner is the customer and this is a vendor organization or whatever, they somehow have to understand that it's not we and they collectively are us. They have to somehow think of themselves as the same team with a shared stake in outcomes. If the dev team is held accountable for bad judgment by the product owner, that often creates a problem. So both of those groups somehow have to be assessed and incentivized or whatever we're going to do in ways that recognize they're supposed to be a cohesive team because they're mutually accountable for the outcome. They can't outperform each other. All right, so that's myth number 2. Now let's roll on to number 3. More awareness somehow equals more control. The problem we have here is that awareness isn't control. Awareness is just knowing about something that's happening. Control is the ability to actually change or perpetuate that pattern, either because we want it or we don't want it anymore. In Agile frameworks like Scrum, our goal is, of course, both. The problem, though, is often where we lack control, we feel like we can substitute for it by just increasing awareness. doesn't really work that way. And why is this a problem for us? Well, let's think about how money tends to work in IT programs. So whatever our budget is, let's just assume whatever the amount of money we have, of the percentages we have, as time increases, systems become more brittle over time, which means we start off building something totally new from the ground up, but eventually we end up spending most of our budget on maintaining the old. There we go. The problem we have is it doesn't seem to matter where we're at on this timeline. There seems like there's always this perpetual 8 to 10% that's spent on overhead and statusing behavior, program management, project management. Right, think about as a government customer, you hire a vendor. How many times do you end up with direct corollaries for every management role on both sides of that contractual fence? So you have a government program manager, and then you have a customer program manager, and you have a government project manager, and you have a a vendor project manager, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And most of what those people are doing is status behavior, which means just telling us what's happening all the time. And if you're way to the right on this curve, if you're already basically up at that statusing ceiling where you're spending almost all of your available budget maintaining an old system, just trying to keep it running, you've got no money or time to build anything new, one way we can start to claw back some space to build new stuff and maybe buy down technical debt so that the system is less brittle and easier to maintain would be to reduce that statusing behavior. But wait, doesn't that mean we won't know what's going on anymore? Doesn't it mean we're not in control? The answer is not necessarily. Let's think about how Agile frameworks like Scrum work compared to, say, legacy waterfall patterns. If we think about visibility in Agile frameworks versus waterfall, well, in waterfall, for a long time, we don't have any visibility, right? We sign a contract with someone, and then they go off in a cave for like a year or like 5 years while they build the thing. What do they get from us in the meantime? And the answer is, excuse me, what do we get from them in the meantime? And the answer, not much as the buyer. We get status reports and Gantt charts, also invoices, percent completes, things like that. Maybe like every month they send us an 8-page Word doc of bullet points of what I did last month, right? A monthly status report or progress report or something. And if you're like me, back when I used to be a project manager, I'd always be desperate for anything to put in there. So like the first bullet is always completed prior month status report, because I gotta put something in there. The problem is all of those status artifacts are really proxies of information about progress. They don't actually tell us what's going on. They really all boil down to, take my word for it, everything's fine. Hey, look, in 3 months, we're at 85% complete. And 6 months later, we're at 86% complete. But trust me, everything's fine. Take my word for it, everything's fine. It's only at the end when we finally make the delivery in a kind of waterfall framework, I can actually prove what's going on. In Agile approaches like Scrum, however, that cave that I was talking about, it basically goes away. Like on a Scrum team, if there is a cave, it's only like 2 weeks long. You don't have to take my word for it. At the end of every single sprint as a team, I'm coming back to you with touchable, tangible slices of product that you can choose to deploy if you want to. You don't have to take my word for it. We can have a super high trust-based relationship. That's really nice. Also, and this is what ties with, because I am constantly proving where we're at time with touchable bits of reality, we can just use product indicator of progress instead of a Gantt chart, instead of a status report, instead of whatever, which means we can save the time and money we spent building those things. We can just redirect that energy towards more product if we want to, more touchable stuff. That's really useful. The problem is, just because we can maybe sunset some of those status artifacts and just replace them with actual reality all the time instead of take my word for it, we maybe don't want to, because there could be a whole bunch of people whose whole jobs are the statusing artifacts, and saying we might not need those anymore is very scary. Also, where do those even statusing behaviors come from in the first place? Well, typically they accrue based on past failures, right? So we need them to fail safe because something broke in the past. So we instituted some new big contract artifact deliverable to make sure that doesn't happen again. Well, those artifacts don't actually prevent anything. They just tell us after the fact whether or not something was broken. So what does this myth look like, confusing awareness for control in practice? Well, in acquisition, you see things in RFPs like this. Vendors shall monitor and report on like a list of 20 legacy waterfall metrics that have nothing to do with Scrum or product outcomes, as well as a bunch of other kind of interesting fictions like Agile earned value management and 20 other process metrics that look at how busy are we, not are we delivering value. And we talked about what that does for us. So the outcome of that kind of stuff is we have a whole lot of focus on process. We're back to counting points instead of product. That's a problem for us. So that's what this looks like, or how it plays out often in the acquisition phase. In execution, when we're building stuff, it's in statements like this. You see people say, I need the teams to count how many manual regression tests they run each day of the sprint. I can run 1 billion of them, and I can get really good at running regression tests. It doesn't tell me, is the product safe or not? That's not the right thing to look at. Or what you also see is, as a result, I don't know why the deployment failed in production. It worked just fine in test. We were aces on all of the programmatic metrics that we're supposed to be keeping track of. Turns out none of them were the right metrics. None of them actually told us about safety, but we looked great on the numbers. That's probably why we've been collecting the numbers. We're investing time in awareness. Turns out we don't actually have control. So the outcome of that, we're spending a ton of money and time on overhead instead of redirecting it towards product, or just not spending the money in the first place. We could actually just save that time and money altogether if we wanted to. So how do we fix this? Focus your awareness on the right things. Let teams tell you what to measure to focus on safety. Let product direction, whoever that is, mission, ownership, focus measurement on product outcomes. Is it safe versus is it the right thing to do? Focus your metric strategies on those two dimensions. Use those metrics once they're focused on the right things to inform your backlog prioritization and increase overall control of your entire value stream of deciding what to do and actually delivering it. And then finally, understand that waste is created just as often as it is inherited. If we have a whole bunch of steps in our processes that add time but don't add value, that's waste. And it's often easy to create more of it out of a sense of trying to substitute awareness for control. It's far easier to do that than it is to be honest and upfront and realize that we don't actually need some of these things anymore. So that's number 3. Let's move on to number 4. We can say teams, we can stay people. So most Agile approaches, especially Scrum, which is far and away the most commonly used approach at the team level in the public sector, they talk about things like cross-functional teams, people being on one team and one team only, and together that group of people having all the skills to go from an idea to whatever done means in one sprint. I think I mentioned that earlier. That's called cross-functionality. And yet we still end up setting up work, both as buyers and sellers, both as customers and vendors, in ways that are still entirely individualistic and perpetuate skill-based silo type optimization functioning, utilization functioning. Causes a problem for us. So let's think about what an Agile team is supposed to own, right? We've got vision on one end, we build the thing, we release it, and now we're operating it. I'm trying to get answers to 2 feedback questions all the time in that process. Does it work yet? If I've answered that question, I can answer the question, does it meet the need? If we think about a Scrum team is supposed to be at least these first 3 bubbles. Vision and build and release all together. And maybe even the 4th bubble too, that would be DevOps, where we have all of these folks together represented in one kind of core group of people who work together and talk together every day. In Scrum, for example, we unite vision with build by having the product owner talk to the dev team every day and have them be part of the same Scrum team. They are us somehow. That's what we want. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work like that. So instead, what we want is a team that plans and commits as a group. They're cross-functional. They can self-organize, which means once they understand what's to be done, they own all questions of how, all that kind of thing. Instead, what happens often is we say we want Scrum teams, and yet, we cut out like project work statements, or we cut out labor category breakdowns, things like that say, here's how many business analysts we want you to hire. Here's how many whatever. We expect one Scrum Master across 14 teams or something like that. What we end up with is we say we want to sell Agile teams or to buy Agile teams, but we set up the acquisition and the execution in a way that really people are still just selling us seats. They're selling us staffing. Doesn't always work out that well for us. In fact, often doesn't. So what does this feel like? Well, in acquisition, it's, for example, if you get a response to an RFP, you're trying to buy Scrum teams, and the bidder is saying, all of our teams will be comprised of a business analyst, a Scrum Master, some developers, and testers. But to make our numbers work, to make the pricing work, the business analyst is 0.15 FTE spread across teams. The Scrum Master is 0.48 FTE spread across teams, and also they have some reporting capabilities. We have 3.4 developers on a team, 0.6 of a tester. How do I have 3.4 developers on a team? People are either on the team or they're not. And if they're on 5 teams, they're on no teams. Those aren't going to be Agile teams. We're going to be back to trying to manage this program of, I don't know, 300 people or something via some 10,000 line Gantt chart integrated master schedule, which doesn't actually make sense and is never true. Or it feels like at the end of each sprint, the dev team will deliver completed product increment to the testing team. If we're actually going to do something like Scrum for real, development and testing are supposed to be the same team. Each team is responsible for development and testing, for example, collectively as a group. But if we're siloing those behaviors, that means we're backing into waterfall again, because the dev team can't deliver value on its own. The testing team can't deliver value on its own. We end up again with all these very risky critical path kind of relationships where any delay cascades across the system and gets magnified. Really dangerous for us. So outcome, we end up with a whole bunch of matrixed groups that can't actually plan or execute reliably because they can't plan because no one actually understands who's a team. They can't execute because we're always stepping on each other's feet because of all these cross-team dependencies. And if we set it up that way in acquisition, we can't later probably fix it in execution. So it's important to fix that up front. The way this myth feels in execution is more like this. Someone saying, I need to know how many story points each team member completes each sprint. Very individualistic version of the work. The team is accountable as a team, not as individuals. And if we have someone who's mostly doing development and someone else who's mostly doing testing, how would we even parse that? I don't know, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't even make sense at the whole team level to compare story points, but it especially doesn't make sense at the individual level. You'll also sometimes see this in the way people are evaluated. Like for your performance review, please quantify your individual contribution to the success, excuse me, of the overall effort. Well, that's a problem for us because I've been telling these people all year, you're a team, you're accountable as a team, you execute as a team, you deliver as a team. Turns out you're actually individual competitors. Whoops. There goes collaboration and quality and knowledge sharing and all that stuff. So how do you fix this? You have to educate stakeholders up and down the chain on what Agile teams mean. Like if we're going to do Scrum, what does being a cross-functional Scrum team mean? And understand why the ability for that team to be cross-functional, self-organized outperforms command and control structures. Matrix-based micromanagement, kind of telling people what to do in 5-minute increments. That's the whole, avoiding that stuff is the whole reason why we went to Scrum in the first place, I thought. So if you're going to do performance measures, make sure they're focused at least at group level, not individualistic. It might be better even though to sunset them entirely and focus on what we know actually motivates great productivity from people. And those are mastery, autonomy, and purpose. You can take a look at, for example, the book Drive by Daniel Pink if you want to know more about that stuff. There you go. All right, so that's that one. And then now the next one, the last one that we'll talk about, and then we'll have some time for questions here. SAFe will save you. If you're not familiar with SAFe, SAFe is one of the kind of formalized Agile scaling frameworks out there. It's called Scaled Agile Framework for Enterprise. There are a bunch of scaling frameworks, actually. SAFe is just one, but there's also LESS, Large-Scale Scrum, Scrum at Scale, Nexus, sort of DSDM is kind of still out there too. Anyway, there's a bunch of them. They all make some different assumptions, but of all of those, SAFe probably still has the largest footprint in the public sector. And often people I've seen programs try to adopt Agile frameworks like Scrum and not have a lot of success because they have a lot of inter-team dependencies, many teams trying to work together to build stuff. Well, that's called scaling. So they adopt SAFe because they think SAFe will fix their problems for them, and it won't necessarily. Now, the reasons I'm going to talk about why it won't aren't actually SAFe's fault, and I'll get to that. SAFe is just often, I think most often, the answer people are picking. Here's the problem we have with scaling, especially in the public sector. So one Scrum team, let's say, is a pretty small group of people, a product owner, a Scrum master, and 3 to 9 people on the dev team. Together as a cross-functional group that can deliver value. Often, though, we need more than one team, more than one small team to build a thing. That's called scaling. So we become a team of teams, or a team of teams, for example. And that's the kind of problem that approaches like SAFe are trying to solve. Well, if you have a whole bunch of teams trying to deliver together, that's very complicated. We're going to need more structure. And SAFe can give you a whole lot of structure. What I have on this slide is the full SAFe implementation model, or I think most recent one, 5.0, according to their website. And we have team level structures and then programmatic structures that they call an Agile release train. And then you might have multiple trains inside of some large solution and then multiple solutions maybe in a portfolio. So potentially hundreds and hundreds of people could be organized in this, ultimately organized down at, say, Scrum teams or Kanban teams down at the team level, but still, that's a whole lot of structure. Well, cool, we like rules, we're used to structure in government work, so what's the problem? The problem is this. The assumption of most scaling frameworks, including SAFe up front, is that we're organized around value streams and we know what the value streams are. So what's a value stream? Well, it's just all the actions that have to happen for us to go from an idea to something in production that we can use. We often think about value streams as being really simplistic, like we have an idea, we build the thing, and then we test it. If it works, we deploy it. If it doesn't, we rebuild it, and then we test it again. Cool. Except that's not what most value streams, especially in the public sector, look like. In the public sector, instead of this very simple, easy to understand map, our maps look more like this. We've got ideas on one end. Oops, excuse me. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself a little bit. New slides. So anyway, if this is our simplified structure, talking about scaling is pretty simplistic. I've got a bunch of teams trying to organize together. So that's like my mission portfolio. Here are all the needs I need to meet, and here are the teams I'm going to do them with. So scaling frameworks assume that we can organize kind of like this. Mission portfolio is controlling ideas and parsing ideas to teams, and then teams can build and test and deliver individually. Well, cool, those are cross-functional teams, which means we probably have a ton of actual business agility in this structure. That's great. This is not what most of the programs where I've done SAFe in the public sector or other scaling frameworks look like. Instead of that simplified value stream I showed you a second ago, their value streams look like this. I've got ideas on one end and prod on the other, and in the middle is this gigantic morass of actions. No one knows what this map looks like until we do what's called a value stream mapping exercise, where I get everybody who participates in this map together in a room, and we parse it all out. It's basically just me holding a marker for like 2 days saying, and then what happens, and then what happens, until we get the whole map. Anybody could hold the marker. I don't know why people pay me to do this, but anyway, I've been paid to do it a whole lot of times. What we discover often after we draw the whole value stream map is that no one actually knew what the map was before. People often know their action and the steps before and after them, but that's often about it. The problem we have with doing scaling in the public sector often is, let's say we know what the value stream is. Where's the mission portfolio chunks of this? That might look something like this, where that mission portfolio is not the whole value stream. They control some of the teams building, their steps in the middle. They aren't the whole map though, which means they don't have control over the whole value stream. The scaling framework we pick won't necessarily solve that because we can't make the rest of those people show up and plan and execute with us. For example, we decide what to build and we build it, but then validation has to be done by some third-party group who takes 6 months. So what's the point of us doing 2-week increment sprints, even as a program, if we're always on a 6 to 9 month delay in, is that stuff good enough to deploy yet? I don't know. And if this is what we start with, and we just layer SAFe on top of it, we're just trying to map boxes to safe rules, for example. Well, if that looks confusing to you and you can't make sense of this chart, neither can anybody else, but that's the way it feels a whole lot. We just layered everything on this. We hired more people. We trained a bunch more folks. We didn't change the value stream. We didn't simplify it. We still don't own the value stream. SAFe won't fix that for you if you can't re-engineer it. That's not SAFe's fault. No other scaling framework would fix it for you either. But often people are looking at SAFe as, oh, if we just do SAFe, that fixes this problem, and it doesn't necessarily. So for example, if we all plan program increments together in a SAFe-based structure, but most of the people on this chart aren't in the room when we do it because they work for a different chunk of the government, well, it doesn't really help us much, especially where we have all these cross-team dependencies and things like that, where we don't own those other teams. That's a problem. So what does this look like in acquisition? People thinking that SAFe, just doing SAFe solves problems structurally. Well, for example, you see things like vendor shall propose a SAFe-based methodology to do the work, when after you price it out, it's actually 12 people. There's a word for doing SAFe with only 12 people. It's called Scrum. But if the vendor insists on buying SAFe anyway, you're going to get either vendors who just pretend to do SAFe to win the work, or vendors who tell you that's not actually what you need, and then they aren't hired. Instead, someone else is hired that will pretend to do SAFe with only 12 people. In execution, it's things like this. You hear people saying, we've scheduled a planning event with all of the front end and the business layer and the database teams. Those sound like silo teams, and some of them probably aren't even in our structure. Or it's hard to plan a program increment because none of our teams are meeting their velocity targets. Again, we're focused on process across the enterprise because we can't actually measure outcomes because we never get to outcomes. That's a problem. We did probably increase overhead though, because we paid to train all these people in their new roles. Oh well. So how do you fix that? If we're going to scale, figure out how to do agility with one team before you're a team of teams or a team of teams of teams. Like have one Scrum team that can deliver before we're trying to have 100 Scrum teams. Focus most on actual value delivery, actual mission or business outcomes, and the time to change an outcome. How quickly can we tell if we're doing the right thing as your North Star metrics above all else? We like to talk in Agile circles about minimum viable product. When it comes to scaling, let's talk about minimum viable bureaucracy. What is the minimum amount of scaling structure we need to get out of our own way and deliver? And don't institute a single bit more than that. And then finally, keep in mind that mission agility or business agility and learning, those are also co-equal products to value. And by business agility, what I mean is just how quickly can we figure out, are we doing the right thing? And if we're not doing the right thing, how quickly could we do something else before we continue wasting money on the wrong thing? So there you go. Those are the myths I wanted to walk you through. I'm happy to spend the rest of our time together answering questions, and I'm happy to stick around a bit past 1 if people have more questions than that. That's my contact info. My Twitter, by the way, Bowtie Agility, is Agile stuff only if you're interested, and by all means reach out on LinkedIn as well. So thanks very much for listening. What can I tell you? All right, pull up chat here. I'm going to stop sharing. We've got a question here. If coaching stakeholders, especially executives, won't change or will not follow, is the company doomed? The short answer is possibly. Not necessarily the company being doomed, but those teams might be doomed, because if we're held to old standards that incentivize the wrong behaviors, those are the behaviors we're going to get out of teams. And we're going to dangle this carrot in front of them that moving to an agile method like Scrum is going to let them actually have some agency, because they're going to get to own how, for example, and be self-organizing, and then we're going to pull that rug out from under them all the time. They'll probably find some other gig that's less frustrating. That becomes a problem for the company because now we're losing people and we can't deliver. Yeah, so maybe those, it's probably going to be very bad for the teams involved and for the mission owners who depend on the outcome of those teams, if nobody else. Somebody's asking, is it possible to get a copy of the slides, as I didn't get everything written down? Yes, absolutely. We'll make those available in a post email if we have everybody's contact from the registrations. Yep, we can absolutely make those available, as we will make available, I think, a recording of this session. Any other questions? Okay, well, I don't hear any. hopefully that's just because no one's asking. I was having a problem earlier this week where all of a sudden I would lose participant audio where you could hear me and each other, but I couldn't hear you. So if you've been asking a question and I've been ignoring you, maybe it's just a glitch on my end, so go ahead and type it in chat. But from this point, I think we're going to end. Any logistical things that I need to cover, Danny or Jen?
No, just thank you, Pat, and for all of you there. I'm Danny Janot. I'm a Senior Training Coordinator with Next Up Solutions. Thank you for joining us. As Pat mentioned, we will be sharing the recording of his webinar via email, so everyone will receive a recording. And no, if you are interested in more training from Next Up Solutions, you can visit us at, and I will drop this in the chat right now, nextupsolutions.com. You can find a full list of our upcoming courses, all virtual until at least September 1st. So we hope to see you in one of our virtual trainings.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
I will stay in the meeting as you file out in case anybody wants to ask a question or chat on the way out. But for everybody else, thanks so much for joining us. And I hope I get to see you all again in classes and things like that. So best of luck with all things. Have a great rest of your Friday. See, someone's asking, are there past webinars to watch? I believe there are, and we can probably supply links to past webinars as well, focused on various topics, Agile and Federal, virtual training, all kinds of stuff. And for all the folks in chat saying thanks, yeah, absolutely, you're quite welcome. Our pleasure. Well, I guess I'm going to stop the recording.